The school for a child is not just a place to learn, it's a place of protection, a place where they come together with other children to play. So that's what's lost in the most horrific way when you have this level of conflict.
As the Middle East enters a new phase of escalation, attention is once again focused on military strategy and regional power. US and Israeli strikes on Iranian targets have triggered retaliation across the region. But far less attention is paid to what war leaves behind. Across conflict zones, education systems are collapsing, schools are destroyed, children are displaced, and one of the last spaces of safety disappears. In this episode, I speak with Dr. Maleiha Malik, Executive Director of the Protect Education and Insecurity and Conflict Program at the Qatar-based foundation Education Above All. A conversation about what it means when education becomes a target of war and what it takes to rebuild it. Welcome to Fokus Nahost. My name is Josephine Herrmann. After weeks of escalating violence, the Middle East is entering a more volatile and uncertain phase. Military dynamics dominate the headlines: strikes, retaliation, deterrence. But war is not only fought on battlefields, it reshapes entire societies. In Gaza, entire education systems have collapsed. In Sudan, Yemen and Syria, generations have grown up without stable access to learning. And in every conflict, schools, often the last place of safety, are among the first to disappear. At the Doha Forum in Qatar, I spoke with Dr. Maleiha Malik, Executive Director of the Protect Education in Insecurity and Conflict Program at the Foundation Education Above All. She is an international lawyer and policy expert who has spent years working on the protection of education in conflict settings, advising governments, international organizations, and multilateral institutions on legal accountability and education policy in crisis zones. Education Above All is a Qatar-based foundation working to protect access to education in some of the world's most fragile and conflict-affected contexts. In our conversation, we discuss what it means when education systems are deliberately targeted, why protecting schools is central to international humanitarian law, and what it takes to rebuild education after war. You've spent your career working with education and conflict collides. When you look at Gaza, Sudan, Yemen, and Syria, what does it mean for society when the basic right to learn is taken away?
Of course, it devastates both the society and its most fundamental precious resource, which is children and young people, and its very future when education is obliterated the way it has been in Gaza, but also destroyed the way it was in Syria, Yemen, and Sudan. But one of the things that's most tragic about all four of the cases that you've said is it was avoidable. So if we look at those four cases, the attack on education, and in particular in Gaza, were deliberate. These weren't accidental acts. These were natural disasters. This is, first and foremost, what is in international law, speaking as an international lawyer, the supreme crime was committed of targeting civilians, deliberately targeting education systems for absolute destruction. So I think, first and foremost, we start with that. Secondly, once the education system is destroyed, it takes decades to get back to the situation you were in before. Take Syria as an example. When the war in Syria started, there was an assumption it would just last a few years. Actually lasted over a decade. It was a devastating war because of the willingness of all parties to use high-grade explosive weapons on civilians and on civilian infrastructure. So you had a country, Syria, had previously had one of the highest literacy rates in the region, an immensely populated professional class, engineers, doctors, dentists, many of who are now in Germany practicing their profession, but who experienced forced displacement as a result of the war. And the war just devastated that country.
Why is protecting education so central for protecting our society's future?
It's absolutely central because the failure to protect education means that the very fundamental resource that we have, human resources, to be able to deliver everything we want, hopes and aspirations of young people, the socioeconomic goods that we would want from a country, all of that gets denuded. But also, most importantly, when we do work with areas of conflict, the school for a child is not just a place to learn, it's a place of protection, a place where they come together with other children to play. So that's what's lost in the most horrific way when you have this level of conflict that we've seen getting worse and worse last year.
In Gaza, entire education systems have collapsed. What are the most urgent steps needed to prevent a generational catastrophe?
So my foundation's absolutely committed to working in Gaza. My program, Protect Education, Security and Conflict, was set up in 2008 to respond to the 2008 bombing of schools in Gaza. And now, as a result of the most recent war, what we are doing is doing a needs analysis along with our UN partners. And that analysis is showing up, of course, the need to rebuild education. I mean, can you imagine nearly 100% of higher education, the universities are wiped out? In relation to primary, secondary education, the first step is that children in Gaza, youngest children, early education, age 2 to 3, all the way up to secondary age 18, have experienced what we call top tier 1 trauma. So we're looking at definitely over 95%, nearly 100% of children have seen the sort of trauma which is unimaginable to you and me. These are children who have seen not just destruction of their school, they've seen their whole family absolutely destroyed, their parents dismembered, in some cases up to 50 members of your family, grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles destroyed. So the first step is to make sure that they have their needs for rehabilitation from trauma addressed. And then we have to think about an education response. The other challenge in Gaza is that we need to make sure that there isn't a segregation and a differentiation between different territorial zones of Gaza, leaving some parts of Gaza to be developed into a nice zone, and the other part of Gaza to be left to become a no-go area. Some people have talked about that, and we're wholly against that approach. So the other thing, if we take Gaza as a whole into account, is that there are parts of Gaza that require demining, parts of Gaza that are contaminated as a result of weapons that shouldn't have been used but have been used. So those are the urgent needs. Once that is addressed, we'll think about the next stage. What we are doing is that, Gaza has amazing young people. It actually had quite, a lot of young people with hopes, aspirations for higher education. So the immediate response we're making is to try and work with universities in the West to make scholarships available to them. And we've done well in relation to that, to make sure that in that temporary space we allow education, especially higher education, to continue.
Across several conflict zones, girls are disproportionately excluded from education. What forms of discrimination concern you most right now?
So I think that, of course, the most extreme example is Afghanistan. And I've done work on that border, Afghanistan-Pakistan border. What's important about that form of exclusion is it's structural. So we are working with our partners to try and make sure girls have access to education there. I have to say that it doesn't help when girls' education is turned into a propaganda item, because that makes our job harder. So I think I would say let's keep this in, let's not turn this into a stick with which we beat other religions, other countries, other cultures. Let's focus on the girls and try and get them back into education. Other examples of structural discrimination, conflict. We did a research project in Nigeria and in West Africa on girls' education and attacks on education. Attacks on education security always has a disproportionate impact on girls because parents don't want to send their girls to school when there is this sort of insecurity. By way of example, we had a project in the West Bank when, girls have to go through huge amounts of, for example, in Hebron to get through checkpoints to access education. That has a disproportionate impact on girls and occupation of that type. But also issues like wash facilities, making sure that the reconstruction of schools takes the needs of girls into account in conditions of insecurity. There's a lot we can do to get girls back to school. Once they're in school, it's just wonderful to see, that they learn, they enjoy themselves, and they use all their cognitive abilities. And of course, their ability to then contribute to the prosperity of their own prosperity first and foremost, but families, communities, their nation. That's wonderful to see.
There are international frameworks to protect schools on conflict, yet violation persists. What needs to change for accountability to actually work?
Yes, that's a really good question. It's very easy to be pessimistic, especially in relation to the examples you've given about legal accountability for education-related violations. But I remain cautiously optimistic because I think that there is an issue with implementation. And yet at the same time, we have seen mechanisms such as the ICC, the International Criminal Court. We've also seen the ICJ case where people are aware of the fact that we're watching you if you perpetrate these types of crimes. We've also seen mechanisms people don't know as much about, but that are really quite successful, such as the Children Armed Conflict process that lists perpetrators of attacks on education. Those legal victories shouldn't be underestimated. What we've actually seen in relation to these sort of cases is that lawyers as a community, jurisprudence as a discipline and as an analytical framework has been rising creatively to the challenge to try and respond to this. So let's hold on to those as optimistic ways forward and come together. One of the most, I think, issues of concern, for all of us as humanity, not just as lawyers, should be the erosion of a commitment to international humanitarian law, which is demonstrated in these conflicts that you've mentioned, all four of them. And I think the ICRC, which is the custodian of the Geneva Convention, does have a campaign now with member states to try and revive political commitment to international humanitarian law. So I would urge those of you listening who have influence within your own country to support that. I think the second one, actually, if I may mention, is that we're now trying to reach a consensus on the use of explosive weapons to get a political settlement, an agreement in place that we're not naive enough to think that wars won't happen. But when they're happening, please don't use explosive weapons in civilian areas. Please make sure schools are sacrosanct when you conduct war, which was also always the essence of the laws of war, that the laws of war should not forget the fact of human life and civilian life as being sacred.
Syria is entering a transitional phase, or is just in the middle of a transitional phase, almost exactly 1 year after the fall of Bashar al-Assad and the formation of a new transitional government under al-Shara, who is here at the Doha Forum today as well. Everything is changing in transitional phases, I mentioned. What does rebuilding education realistically mean after more than a decade of collapse?
Yes, that's a really good question. As I mentioned earlier, Syria's had a particularly devastating war, and it's particularly tragic. Harvard Humanitarian Initiative did an analysis of the war in Syria, and over a decade of literacy lost and learning lost in Syria. So I think that in Syria, as everywhere else, our method, our approach, to be absolutely honest with you, the only approach that's going to work is to listen to the people of Syria themselves. So this colonial model of expensive consultants flying in and imposing solutions in countries is just, A, we know it doesn't work, B, it's just not acceptable in terms of the autonomy and agency of Syrians themselves. So I think the agencies have learned their lessons, the multilateral agencies. I think in going in, Syrians are a very well-educated population. I think we listen to them first and foremost. That ensures that precious financial resources, because there aren't many nowadays, for aid and development are used more intelligently in a sustainable way. So we start off from first principles, democratic principles of listening to the people for whom we are doing this work, and we build out of that. But I think that, the European Union has played a constructive role in Syria. Now that there is a peace process, other states within the area are playing a constructive role. So we would like to see the peace holding. And what the research demonstrates is that quality education that's provided to people equally, i.e. men and women, religious groups, ethnic groups, on a fair and equal, just basis, does have the ability to reduce the length of conflict and make sure that peace processes hold. So we'd like to see that in places where there's more optimistic news around peace, Syria, potentially Colombia as well.
What lessons from Sudan and Yemen should guide international actors so they don't repeat past mistakes?
I mean, Yemen and Sudan, the first lesson, if we know the history of what happened in Sudan, if we saw what's happening in Yemen now, is the most horrific violations of international humanitarian law. I mean, both countries, especially in Sudan recently, as in Gaza, what we see is engineered starvation. We see the medieval practice. I don't like using medieval as a historical insult, but if it is going to be used, this practice of using starvation as a tactic of war, that we thought we would not see for those of us who thought that international humanitarian law had made practice. So starving young children, denying food to enter into conflict-affected areas. So the lesson for the international community is that we isolate, we shame, we hold to account perpetrators, and we know who they are, right? We know who's done this. They can't hide. We hold them accountable. We make sure that it never happens again, these sort of violations.
How are you going to make sure about
You have to make sure they're accountable. Right. So you don't pander to them. You point fingers, even if as a country, I mean, those of you who are listening who work in like state, diplomacy, foreign policy is complicated. Let's not be naive about it. But it's not in the interests of anyone to allow these perpetrators to get away. And I think that, this is a Berlin-based podcast. Germany knows what it means to live through genocide and atrocity. And it's very important to have that process of accountability to make sure that victims themselves are able to know that justice is being done. So I think that's a starting point. After that, I think we strengthen multilateral organizations. I think there's a real attack on multilateralism by those with immense power, some of the greatest powers that we have. I think particularly in Europe, in Germany, in the United Kingdom, the European Union, we have to hold the line on democratic principles. We have to hold the line on multilateralism and to make sure that this is the foundation on which we build a global world order.
Where do you see resilience? Which local actors give you hope that education systems can recover?
It's the kids themselves, first and foremost. You meet them and it's a double-edged sword because you meet them and you think, my gosh, you're so resilient. But also you have to acknowledge that this level of trauma is something they shouldn't have experienced. They're still children. And yet we're in a better place now. We've done a lot. We've learned a lot about strategies that will help them recover. First and foremost, those kids who survived. Can you imagine surviving that kind of horror? They've survived. They're now calling out to us to be treated as equal citizens, as part of humanity. We try and provide them with the essential, basic, fundamental services our own children take for granted. Just think if those were your children, how you would feel. So the resilience starts there. Civil society is very weakened. In the case of Gaza, for example, it's deliberate targeting, using often AI, using often, the most horrific weapons to make sure that academics are killed, scholars are killed. Anyone who could have been the leadership in Gaza has been taken out, as it were, in a way that's deeply self-defeating for those doing this, because you have to have someone to work with. You have to have someone to negotiate with. A peace is made with the other side. You don't make peace with yourself. So it's very sad to see this being done. But there are glimmers of hope. We're talking to actors on the ground, young Palestinians, about a campaign for demining, decontamination. They're there. They're there on the land. So I think we should accept that reality. I think we should work with them to help them rebuild civil society. And that kind of resilience is really makes me optimistic. We had recent good news in Colombia, for example, where I had, if I may move away from the region,
yes, please.
Because this is a global issue. In Colombia, we had a good news story recently, which was that we worked with civil society organizations, legal system, and next week they're about to introduce criminal law in in their democratic chamber to criminalize attacks on education, because Colombia within the Western world has had the highest rates of attacks on education for decades because of the conflict there. And there's still a lot of recruitment of young kids into armed groups, which has all sorts of knock-on effects, including for narcotics and the drug trade, where they end up being misused. So a glimmer of hope, working with civil society in Colombia, where they're going to, as part of their peace process, make sure that they safeguard their education system.
Maleiha, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
This was a new episode of Focus Nahost with Dr. Maleiha Malik, Executive Director of the Protect Education in Insecurity and Conflict Program at Education Above All. If you found this conversation valuable, please consider sharing it, subscribing to the podcast, and leaving a review. It helps ensure that more people can hear these perspectives. You can also read the full transcript of this interview in my Substack newsletter. And if you're interested in the broader regional context, I recently spoke with Iraq's Deputy Foreign Minister, Dr. Hisham al-Alawi, about escalation, militias, and the risk of Iraq becoming a battleground in a widening Middle East war. My name is Josephine Herrmann. Thank you for listening, and I speak to you soon.